Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen Von Hippel. I'm the director at RUSI, and it's really my pleasure to welcome you to this first event in a new series we're launching called Rebalancing Expertise in Defense and Security. Today, we are looking at UK security policy. It's called Rethinking UK Security Policy. And this initiative was really established as part of a commitment we made at RUSI when we recently signed up to the Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy Initiative. It's an important effort really dedicated to improve gender balance within the community working on nuclear weapons issues. Now, we believe we want to do this beyond the nuclear field, obviously, and we believe in diversity writ large. And so this event not only supports that Gender Champions Initiative by providing a platform to address the whole defense and security community more broadly, but also we really want to think about and highlight and elevate underrepresented voices in our field. And we're not doing this just to tick the boxes. We're doing this because actually greater diversity really contributes to better policy development and policy implementation. So it's really important that we all think through in a much more considered way different ways to approach this challenge. The interesting thing is this week also happens to be National Inclusion Week, and so it's perfect timing for today's event. Now, in our discussion today, we are going to look at UK security policy. We will be looking at domestic and international policy and the role that diversity and inclusion play in not just policy development, but also implementation. I think there are two sides of the coin that need to be considered in these conversations. You probably all know that Whitehall is in the middle of the integrated review, and the word integrated really does mean integrating all parts of all the tools of government, whether that's security, defense, development, and foreign policy. And they're really trying to define the government. They say the quote is to define the government's vision for the UK's role in the world over the next decade. Now, I think as we all know, this review is taking place during an extremely challenging time, not only here in the UK, but globally. We're obviously all wrestling with this global pandemic. We're coming to you on virtually because of that. We're dealing with a rising and assertive China. We're dealing with the United States withdrawing from its traditional leadership role. We're dealing with an assertive and aggressive Russia and other challenges globally. And we're also dealing with Brexit, which obviously is going to be finalized over the next few months. So there's a number of challenges that we're facing. The government is trying to understand its role and define its role globally and to deal with many of these challenges. And so it's a really good opportunity to think through the role that diversity and inclusion play in managing all of these challenges. It is, I mean, I personally believe, and I think my colleagues will all agree with me, that more diverse voices will be integral and critical to that conversation. So to discuss these issues, it's a real pleasure that we are welcoming such a distinguished panel. We're really grateful that all of our panelists have joined us today, not just from across the UK, but from further afield. And our conversation today will be moderated by Suzanne Rain, who is very qualified to guide us today. I'm just going to say a few words about her background. She's an affiliated lecturer at the Center for Geopolitics at Cambridge University. She's also a member of the Board of Trustees at the Imperial War Museum. And even more important, she is a RUSI trustee. She has a very long and distinguished career in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and it includes overseas postings in Poland, in Iraq, and in Pakistan during some of the more difficult times in those countries. She's worked primarily on national security issues. She's specialized in counterterrorism and held a number of senior domestic appointments, including the head of the Joint Terrorism Analysis Center, JTAC, from 2015 to 2017. And she was a senior member of the UK government assessment community, and really is a big thinker, an important thinker in the role that assessment plays in many of the challenges we're facing. So really, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Suzanne and just welcome everyone and thank you all for joining us. Suzanne.
past critical errors unmuting. Thank you very much, Karen, and I'm delighted to have been asked to host this. I think it's a really important event. So I hope that the next 90 minutes is a rich and fruitful conversation, and that you, the audience, enjoy it and participate in it, because that's what it's for. This is a subject that we've been talking about for a long time, and the risk is that these discussions become a substitute for action. We don't want this discussion to be a substitute for action. We want it to be a catalyst for action, especially, as Karen said, this is British National Inclusion Week. So I was looking, inclusive employers have a slogan which says, each one reach one. So if each of us in this conversation reaches out, then Rusi will have had an exponential result in that one. Really, we're going to be asking, what does rebalancing expertise mean? And that's kind of in practice. What, we talked about it forever. What does it mean in practice? We've got a fantastic panel, which I hope is going to come up with some concrete ideas of not just where we are now, but how we can be better. So we're going to talk until about 2 o'clock. And then we're going to have about half an hour for questions. Obviously, that will flex depending on how the conversation goes. You, the audience, are currently muted. So if you want to ask a question, type it in the Q&A, not the chat. And you can actually vote up questions. So I don't know quite how, but basically, if you vote them up, then that increases the likelihood that I'll see it and ask it. And I apologise in advance if we don't get through all of them. So now to our brilliant panel. Dr. Tony Hastrup is Senior Lecturer in International Politics at the University of Stirling up in Scotland, and her teaching and research focus on global governance of security and the role of regional actors, and she's published on gender equality, feminist foreign policy, and the role and the women, peace and security agenda. Lord Hogan Howe is a distinguished fellow of RUSI, was previously Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, which was a force of 50,000 responsible for policing a population of 9 million. Before that, he was Chief Constable of Merseyside and Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabularies. He has a lot of experience working in the national security area, particularly as Met Commissioner, was responsible for national CT policing. And he is now a member of the House of Lords. He's a non-executive director of the Cabinet Office, and he also has a number of commercial and charitable concerns, ongoing responsibilities. And for the purposes of this conversation, because this is about inclusion and diversity, we're going to call him Bernard, which is his name. Christine St-Pierre is an advisor and trainer on gender equality and women, peace and security in Canada, and she's worked with international and Canadian organisations, government and academic institutions, advising on gender equality and mainstreaming strategies. She's a member of the steering committee of the Women, Peace and Security Network in Canada, which is a voluntary organisation consisting of up to 70 civil society institutions and individuals whose aim is to monitor and hold to account the Canadian government on its commitments to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And she's also a very talented folk singer, so Google her. Sabine Khan is a RUSI Senior Associate Fellow who has worked for 10 years in the UK Office for Security and Counter-Terrorism within the Home Office, and she's played a significant role in establishing OSCT as a centre for excellence. In particular, she has advanced the government's understanding on counter-terrorism issues and the evolution of its response to the issue of Islamist radicalisation. Sabine has championed gender diversity and diversity in all its forms throughout her life. In 2006, she was appointed by the Minister for Women and Equality to serve as Commissioner for the Women's National Commission. So this is a fantastic panel. Thank you all very much for joining us. I'm going to start, Christine, with a question for you. Why does this matter?
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, RUSI, for inviting me and inviting a Canadian perspective to today's really important discussion. So I will start first by saying that diversity and inclusion is really a matter of human rights. And there's a saying that says diversity invites people to the table, but inclusion empowers their voice to be heard and really to be considered at that table. So we have to think about that very big difference between kind of having that seat, but also being seen, being heard, and being considered as part of policy development in terms of security and foreign policy. And as Karen mentioned at the beginning, research is really clear in terms of diverse organizations and that they're better able to understand the marketplace. They're better able to respond to the diverse needs of the population and demonstrate greater what we call operational effectiveness. However, an inclusive organization really needs to utilize and value its diversity. And this is done by supporting them, by ensuring that they can all contribute to their full capacity. It's really about creating an environment where people of all backgrounds can thrive. And from a security and foreign policy perspective, I think one of the critical things we need to ask ourselves when we talk about diversity and inclusion is to what end? Because we know that changing who sits around the table changes outcomes and decisions. But we also know that that's not enough. True inclusion really requires that deep cultural change, especially when it comes to patriarchal structures, such as the security sector and the security field. Now, if change is to occur, organizations need to be very clear on answering that question of to what end, why diversity and inclusion matters to them, and what they're willing to do to get there. And the last point I will make before I'm sure other colleagues will join, is a truly and diverse, inclusive approach to security and foreign policy. In order to have that truly and inclusive approach, you really have to recognize that security is perceived differently by different members of society. And that includes men, women, people of diverse gender identities, sexual orientation, ethnicities, abilities, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. That's a lovely sort of umbrella explanation to start us off, and we can go in lots of different directions. I was going to ask Bernard now if you could set the scene for us now. So what are the security challenges for us now that gives us some context for the conversation that we're having?
Well, thank you. For me, there are two big areas that we always have to keep an eye on. So the first thing is what's happening at home. Are we being inclusive at home, or are we being exclusive? And the second is what's British foreign policy abroad. Both act as axes for what happens on the streets in the UK, which is the particular area that I'd concentrate on. You've got the running challenges that are always there against counter-proliferation, about the fact that there's espionage. Other countries are going to be interested in some of our secrets, commercial and state-based. We've got the immediate issues around people crossing the channel and, maintaining a secure border. But the biggest areas that I think the security service and the police are facing at the moment are around extreme forms of Islamism. Irish terrorism is still around. Extreme right-wing terrorism is still there, and I would argue growing and becoming more organised. It's generally been disorganised, but the internet has allowed it to become more organised. And I think we would be foolish to ignore its latent capacity and sometimes its actual threat. So for me, those are the biggest issues. And of course, we have a distorting factor at the moment, which is about civil disobedience around some very important issues around the environment. Black Lives Matter has been another big issue that's caused society to reflect on on how it goes forward, and also cause public protest, which is something the police will sometimes be distracted by, as well as have to deal with. They've really got to consider that in deploying their resources and prioritising. So for me, those are the big things that we have to consider. And the context in which we consider that is obviously a very diverse country. Christine's already mentioned that we've the fact that we have minorities in very significant proportions, particularly if we look in London, around 38%, 40% of the population here are visible minorities. If we look around the country, then distribution of minorities is different. And in fact, minorities' experiences when they're in smaller numbers can be far worse than when they're in a critical mass where they can support each other. And that was my experience in places like Merseyside, which has been mentioned earlier. And I think that in considering the diverse nation that we have to consider how we as a society react to difference, whether that be sexual orientation, whether it be gender, and then how other countries who we sometimes have as friends, and sometimes we are not quite sure whether they're friends, whether they're friends or they're not, how they deal with or they support or don't support minorities is vital to how we have relationships with them. And it's sometimes quite a contest when obviously there are some vital UK interests based in the countries in which we find sometimes least attractive.
Thank you very much, Bernard. And again, there's an awful lot we're going to sort of pull out and draw on our conversations. And I'm going to divide into two parts the follow-up here. I'm going to ask Sabine to comment on the domestic and Tony to comment on the overseas aspects of what you've just said. So Sabine, building on Bernard's observations of the sort of very real problems that we've got in the UK on the security front and the difficulties of engaging with our own diverse population. I'd be really interested if you could say something on how diversity and inclusion impacts on our understanding of the problem and what we might do in response to the problem.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I mean, inclusion and, diversity, is critical and in many different ways. I mean, if you look, for instance, at the national security workforce, I think the first point I'd like to make is that if you speak to the senior leaders across the UK national security community, there is no doubt about the personal commitment and efforts to ensure their organisations are diverse and inclusive workplaces. I mean, they have defined this as mission critical. Indeed, this commitment was also recognised by the Intelligence and Security Committee in 2018, when they undertook a review across the intelligence agencies and organisations to scrutinise the groups which are underrepresented in terms of gender, sexuality, ethnicity, and disability. And I mean, there's no doubt the heads of these organisations and the ISC would note that, whilst there have been improvements, there are significant challenges. As Bernard has highlighted, the UK civil service does not fully reflect the ethnic makeup of modern Britain. The counter-terrorism community is less diverse than the civil service as a whole, and the counter-terrorism senior leadership is even less diverse. Now, I recall the ISC noting that, around 2016 to 2017, just one of the organisations had any staff at senior civil service level who declared as BME. And this does have an impact, as you've asked, Suzanne, on the culture of the national security community. It does inevitably lead to a narrow set of perspectives and the effectiveness of the response when dealing with the range of different national security threats. And I think for me, inclusion, should be prioritized. When I look at, the last 20 years when we've had to deal with the threat from Islamist terrorism, the lack of inclusion of Muslim experts and practitioners has impacted the quality of our analysis, assessments, policy approaches, and programs. These experts, in comparison to others, do not have a seat at the table when important decisions are being made. Their expertise is not valued, not listened to, and dismissed. And over the years, and even now, Muslim experts regularly speak to me about their despair at the quality and lack of academic rigor on research on Islamist radicalization and Muslim communities. Another point to highlight is that many of these practitioners who have been on the front line have actually made a huge contribution to this country, but they have not been recognized. And I think, at the end of the day, the key lesson is that proper inclusion requires effort, prioritization, and resourcing. And for most people, it's too difficult when they're trying to balance all the competing pressures in their daily workload. But let me be clear, if we don't have, an integrated strategic approach by where including everybody and engaging with the public, then we're not, doing our job properly, and we are undermining diversity, equality, and inclusion. And some of the key lessons from Windrush on how we improve the way we work are equally relevant to the discussion today.
Thank you, Sabine. Some really important points, which I want us to come back to when we then move on to a conversation very soon about how we're going to make things better. First, though, from Tony, can you put this in a global context? So talk about the global problem, but also put the UK in the global context for us, please.
Thank you again, Suzanne, and to Rusi for inviting me to participate here. When I think of the global context, so in that sense, the United Kingdom is not unique when we think about the sort of national security workforce, and the security sector in general is still one that is relatively homogeneous, whether it's with regards to gender globally or with regards to ethnic minorities in majority white countries here in the global north, and similarly in a lot of countries in the global south, where you have perhaps dominant ethnic groups participating within the security sector. So in that sense, issues around diversity and inclusion is a global one. I think one of the things that has been quite useful, perhaps in the last 2 decades, is that there is an increasing awareness that we need to do something institutionally, that it's not enough to talk about it. I think, as all the previous speakers have noted, this is not a new problem at all. We all have been in spaces based on our own experiences, and we know that this is not new in the slightest way. But oftentimes what we find is, despite the individual commitments of those who are tasked with ensuring greater diversity and inclusion, due to a lack of resources, which has already been mentioned, but also due to the ways in which the security sectors have been institutionalized. So the ways in which they were not designed necessarily for the types of equality and inclusion concerns that we currently have. It is very difficult to change. And I think that's one of the things that I wanted to highlight, that, at least within the academic space, we are very aware, we're very cognizant that, despite individual agency that everybody here has noted, institutions can be very difficult to change, whether it's in terms of like the procedures that are put in place. It's very, very difficult to change. That said, I often argue, well, although this is true, institutions are often also made up of people. So what you do need is, you definitely need people who would champion this idea, and it has to start from the top. So this is where I place the UK in global context. If we want diversity and inclusion in the global security governance space, then we need leadership for it, right? So you have examples of countries like, say, Sweden, who's gone the route of championing human rights, gender equality, representation, dedicating resources to promoting the perspectives and experiences of women in its foreign policy. And as we've already mentioned, we cannot divorce what we're doing externally from what is happening internally. I think that's one thing that most foreign policy experts would agree on, that the domestic very much influences the external. And because the domestic influences the external, the question we have to ask ourselves as Britain is, when we talk about our interests on the one hand, and then we talk about our values on the other hand, to what extent do they actually meet? Because in the end, when we're talking about leadership in those particular spaces, these two things have to speak to each other. And we have examples of, so Bernard mentioned people who might be friends we might be friendly with that are not necessarily consistent with, what it is that we might try to do. And of course, again, pragmatic reasons might dictate that you engage with people, even in our everyday lives, that you might not necessarily want to engage with. So I think it's important not necessarily to discount that pragmatism. But I also think that there does need to be a move going forward where what we consider to be values, internal values, what we're working towards internally begin to converge with what our foreign policy practices are. And that, of course, feeds into the security practices as well. Are our security practices such that they engender equality, diversity, and inclusion? Or are we simply supporting programs that are supposed to engender this, but doing something else? So that, I think that's a question for all of us, but especially those in leadership positions to consider. And as I said, I do see the UK being potentially being a leader here in thinking these things through.
Thank you, Tony. And of course, a lot to think about there, because we're supposed to have had a values-based foreign policy for quite a long time now, but our values perhaps keep evolving, or the foreign world keeps changing. Bernard, there's been a few points in the last from Tony and Sabine about leadership. Could I turn to you from your perspective, having been, a leader of one of the main sort of organisations in the national security picture? Some thoughts about what has been done, what could be done, but also I'd be really interested in what you've learnt since that you wish you'd known when you were Met Commissioner. Oh, you need to unmute.
Sorry. First of all, just in terms of what can be done and what could be done, one of the things that we change. First of all, I think you have to, rather than just react, I think you have to analyse. And then I think most minorities or disadvantaged groups want you to make clear proposals about what are you going to do, not what are you going to say. Now, both are important. You want people to say supportive things, but at the end of it, what are you going to do? Yeah. So for me, the analysis, for example, in my experience in the Met, was that we had 2 or 3 challenges. We weren't representative of the London that we policed. Now, we had all sorts of reasons for that, and some would say excuses. So we had a low turnover of staff, 5% a year. So it takes you 20 years to change. It's slow. I think Tony mentioned about slow change. When I looked at it, 2/3 of our recruits came from outside London and didn't have the same makeup as the people of London, because people from Northern Ireland and Scotland were attracted to working in London as a cop, and we were recruiting in large numbers. So we did 2 or 3 things that made quite a difference. We said that if you could only join the Met if you had lived in London for 3 of the last 5 years. And you could do that legally. And secondly, we said that we'd give priority to people who spoke one of 19 languages. And German could be really important for some parts of Africa, so could French and that started to make a real impact, so that we started to, we got to a point where we got 1 in 3 recruits. But then more recently, we've seen that the government's big drive has been to get growth, get another 20,000 cops. Given what I've just said about turnover, a great opportunity to see a change in the makeup of the police. But I think the big challenge is going to be, we want to see cops. Do we want to see representation in that? Because it may take a little longer than the 2 or 3 years that we want to see that growth in. So I think, first of all, for me, it's important to do the analysis, then to make some concrete proposals. And then the leadership, that, as Tony pointed out, is to be very clear about what your objectives are. And if you want to see real change, it may be you have to wait a little longer in recruitment. And then the second thing for me, which I think Christine mentioned, is about how do you support people once they're in the organisation. And I think one of the things that I've reflected on since leaving is I don't think we did do enough to support people in the organisation. We had 17 different staff support associations, Anglo-Italian groups, Muslim Association, Black Police Association, the Gay Police Association. But I'm not sure we as an organisation did enough to provide support. We did some things, and I could list them, but I don't think they're as effective as things we did around recruitment, for example. I think we needed to do far more around the misconduct and discipline side. We had the representation there. So for me, I think those are some big things that I've thought about afterwards. I thought we could have been more creative, more directive, and more interventionist, and given a few things a try. Sometimes it's hard to start things because people see the risks of new things. My attitude has always been the risk of standing still is quite high. Let's take a step forward. But not everyone will feel like that, particularly in this very sensitive area. I think finally, this second area for me is also about how does a public service in particular operationalize what it does, whether it's a health service or in my sense, the police. You can be very representative of the society you police, but if you carry your service out in a way that people feel is prejudiced or is disproportionate, then you lose the benefit you've had of being a diverse organization. So for me, Stop Search was a big area that we reduced by about 2/3, reduced the disproportionality, but didn't remove it. For people of an Asian appearance, we got down to about a 1-to-1 ratio compared to the white population. But for the Black Afro-Caribbean groups, we reduced it, but we didn't get to parity. And I couldn't fully explain that, even though we reduced, let's say, Stop Search in a massive way, and yet arrested more people, and crime came down. So we could show that by doing it better, we can actually still deliver an operational service. So whether you be the health service, the civil service, the police, I think how you carry out your role, is it perceived to be fair, proportionate, and have an element of justice, which gets the support of society, or is it seen as just something that amplifies the problems we're all describing, and not supporting people in the way that we say we all want to do?
Thank you, Ben. Can I just pick, just to clarify, I think that what you said basically is evolution is too slow, and so we are going to need to continue to take deliberate steps to sort of address this problem, because it's not going to happen just through recruitment and hoping that some of them get promoted and end up in leadership positions. Is that what you said? Yes,
in short, if you looked at, many public services have the benefit of a vocational pull, whether it be a health service, police, civil service. So therefore you could wait 20 years, and people in the public meetings I went to said, you still all look like white guys who are leading this organization. So when will that change? And to give a straight answer, you've got to have some straight proposals. It's not all about recruitment, but that's an element of it. So, I mean, for example, if you look at what happened in Northern Ireland, I raised that as one of the present, still continuing terrorist threats. But the Lord Patten inquiry of a few years ago now made a very specific proposal that said that in recruiting for 10 years, there would be a different statutory basis on which to recruit. And the simple point was, you can recruit from the unionist community when you recruited from the Catholic community, broadly 50-50. They didn't change their standards. What it meant that sometimes Catholics got recruited earlier, and it may take a unionist or a Protestant a further 18 months to get recruited, but the chance to be a cop was still there. And they got from about 10% representation up to a half within 10 years. And it did make a difference. They've had some challenges since they've removed that statutory opportunity. And then you can look at whether you can feed in leaders at a higher position that shows that the leadership is more representative of what you're trying to deliver. We experimented with getting in superintendents who'd never been a cop, which is counter to the police culture. All police officers like me start on the street, walk the streets, and then eventually get off into specialisms or to promotion to the top. But we recruited superintendents who'd never been a police officer. We recruit about 25. As far as I'm aware, I think one has left in the last 5 years, and they've proved to be really able people. But the culture is not going to welcome them. And one of the things I said to them, there's not 50,000 people hoping that you succeed. There's probably 50,000 people thinking you probably will fail. But if you're prepared to take a risk from time to time, you can make real improvements. And I think there are a number of practical things that can be done that can make a difference, but you've got to be determined and you've got to keep it going over years.
Thank you. That's great. Christine, from the Canadian perspective, I know you've got a number of things going on in Canada that it would probably be useful for us more broadly to be aware of if we're not already.
Yes, and I think it will speak to a number of the points that have already been made in terms of, ensuring that there's really that effort, that intention, and also the resources, and as Tony mentioned, kind of that convergence of intention. So I wanted to mention or highlight kind of 3 points which they're kind of good practices, I guess, but identified from a civil society perspective and our network, who has been really, as you mentioned, kind of holding the government to account on these issues for a number of years. So briefly, I just want to touch on Canada's feminist approach to foreign policy, which kind of puts all that into kind of one big intention. There's also the government-wide approach to intersectional gender analysis, and then engagement with civil society and women's organization. So in terms of the first point, so if you're actually looking for an actual feminist foreign policy document, you will not find one. However, the government has been clear that its approach to feminist foreign policy is defined by a number of policies that have come out in the last few years. And that includes the National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. It includes our feminist international assistance policy, which looks at international development assistance. There's inclusive approach to trade, the defense policy, as well as a policy on gender equality and humanitarian action. And as I just mentioned, I think those policies and that kind of approach to the feminist foreign policy really sets out a rather clear commitment to promote and protect human rights and gender equality, as well as foster diversity and inclusion. So it's really setting out that intention outwards to the world. And it's also done by saying that it focuses on addressing fundamental structural barriers that prevent gender equality, but also taking into account the needs of those most affected by multiple forms of discrimination. The second point, which also supports this feminist approach to foreign policy, is what the government has implemented kind of government-wide, which is called a gender-based analysis plus approach, so GBA plus. And really it's an analytical approach that was developed in response to the need to mainstream gender perspectives as part of all government initiatives. And, the importance here is that it really seeks to be transformational and intersectional. And there are still some challenges for sure, but the intention is there. And many government departments have taken that on and ensured that their staff and their policymakers have that approach in mind. And the important part is also the plus, which goes beyond that binary analysis to include intersections of gender with other identities, other identity factors such as age and religion, ethnicity, race, culture, income.
Christine, can I just interrupt? Yeah. Who has drawn that up and implemented it? Is this something which has developed because there is a greater amount of diversity at board level in Canadian decision-making national security structures?
Well, I mean, interestingly, the GBA approach was actually implemented or came into effect in 1995. So following the Beijing Platform for Action, and also it's a commitment in terms of the CEDAW Convention. Various governments, but mostly our development agency, was really implementing this because of their outward, their development policy and the real impact of gender inequality in development. In 2015, our Auditor General made a report, an analysis of kind of who was doing what in terms of that gender-based analysis, and the outcome was it was not being applied across the board. And so there was a real lack in terms of implementing this. And so since 2015, there's been a real push by government to implement this approach, but also that plus has been, yes, a tremendous kind of, add-on, not just add-on, but a change in terms of our understanding and our approach, that it's not just gender-based analysis, but certainly that intersectional approach is key when you're analyzing your policies and wanting to have to ensure that you have the most targeted solution possible. And I guess I'll just mention the third point very briefly, which is that engagement with civil society and women's organization. And I think one of the changes, at least from a civil society perspective, that we've seen also with a change in government, but in the last few years, is that really that willingness to engage, but the recognition that engagement is key and important, and that civil society and women's organizations' contributions are very significant in terms of Canada's security and Canada's foreign policy. And that also comes back to those diverse perspectives and, being on the ground and our, different perspectives in terms of what security means to different members of society.
Thank you. Sabine, engagement is key. This, I know, will be a subject close to your heart. I'd like you, if you may, to comment on that, how you engage with the different aspects of society, particularly those where you may have a different definition of security. But also, if I might ask you, Sabine, to comment on the risk that is there, that because we don't have it as diverse as we might have national security community, we essentially take a gendered standpoint when we're analysing the opposition. So we see men as terrorists and women as victims, even if they join terrorist groups, for example. Could you comment on those two aspects, please?
Yeah, sure. I think, the key aspect of, inclusion, another aspect of it, I think the comments have already been made, is public engagement. If you want to be inclusive, you have to engage at the public level, and public trust matters if we want communities across the UK to cooperate with us on counterterrorism measures. Suzanne, you'll know that, I spent most of my time in OSCT traveling up and down the country with senior officials, talking about, domestic security and foreign policy, whether that was in a community centre in Birmingham, or speaking to Somali women in Southall, or speaking to, young students in East London. And I think one of the, key, observations I've noticed over the last 10 years is that actually there have been a range of actors who have been working effectively and very hard to spread misinformation, to prevent, public cooperation, and at worst attempted to derail vital counterterrorism work. And this is clearly harmful to our national security. And so I think that, across the counterterrorism community, there is clearly much more we can do to go across the country and to speak to diverse communities and people of all backgrounds about counterterrorism measures. We should explain, and I think Bernard's made this point, reassure and instill confidence around Schedule 7, at the airport, and stop and search, for example. And I recall, a couple of years ago, one senior leader, he told me, that if the senior echelons of the national security community, and the terms he used were male and pale, he said they need to front engagement to instill confidence. confidence. You know, these national security leaders need to allow communities to subject them to scrutiny to demonstrate that there are no examples of bias in their counterterrorism policy making, assumptions and delivery. And I think that is critical. On your second point on, you know, the assumptions that have been made. I mean, again, over the years, we've been, you know, deeply frustrated about some of the poor analysis in relation to women that have been involved in jihadist groups, and seeing them more as the kind of victim rather than the perpetrator. I think we both, you know, disagree with that analysis. And again, I think it comes down to the fact that, you know, if you don't have experts from, you know, a more comprehensive, you know, body of, you know, of opinion, then you are going to have narrow sets of perspectives on all of these issues. I mean, that's been one, you know, area that I've been frustrated with. Again, my ongoing frustration has been, you know, how we've been analyzing, you know, Islamist radicalization in Muslim communities. I mean, and this is not just a problem in Whitehall. I think it's a bigger problem actually across academia, local authorities, public bodies, and journalists, where they've tended to continuously homogenize Muslim communities. And then in that, there's a conflation of a whole, you know, range of different issues, quite a superficial analysis actually of some of the problems. And at worst, you know, some of them have actually co-opted dominant Islamist narratives, you know. And again, another point we've made, you know, we've had a poor understanding of far-right extremism. So across all of these areas, I think, you know, having a more comprehensive body of experts that we can speak to on a range of these issues, no doubt will broaden our understanding and critically ensure that we have got our finger on the pulse of what is happening within some of these communities at the local level.
Thank you, Sabine. So in terms, I'm just trying to note down practical things we might do. So there's more comprehensive body of experts somewhere. And I think, I mean, this is one of the things that organizations like RUSI are there to help with, really. So it's insofar as we can, that is very much an intention to sort of keep building. Tony, you've been very patient. I mean, I think, I don't know which bit of it to ask you to comment on, really. I mean, this idea that the UK could play a leading role in pushing this agenda overseas doesn't seem like we're quite ready to do that yet. How does it feel in relation to what Christine has talked to you about Canada, or I don't know, against basically the global landscape as you're looking at it in your Women, Peace and Security studies?
Yes, I think Christine has very nicely set the scene in terms of how we think countries can take on leadership. So the first thing to say is that internally within the UK, sort of thinking about mechanisms, we are quite similar to Canada, right? So we have a duty to implement the CEDAW. We have subscribed to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and we've taken the lead at the Security Council for advocating for more attention to women's human rights defenders, for example. We have a very vibrant civil society community that is engaged in equality, diversity, and inclusion issues at the international level. So in that sense, I would say, you know, we do have a lot of the tools that might make space for a lot of what we've been talking about today. But at the same time, I think it is also fair to note that intentions are very important, and being able to articulate to what end is very important, but you need to put, for lack of a better term, some elbow grease into it. It's not enough to simply have these policies, these mechanisms, if we're not going to use them. And I think that's the key point I wanted to make. So a few years ago, the Foreign Office, the UK Foreign Office, really championed the dimension around protecting women from sexual violence, which was a very big initiative, and it was important that it was coming from the Foreign Office. It was a way for the United Kingdom to situate itself within a broader international community, but also a space to be reflective about what kinds of practices were going on within the country, which I think it will be fair to say that, you know, we are quite lacking in terms of that sort of protection for women within our own country. But in any case, the space was created. Well, you know, fast forward a few years, there's a question of, well, you know, where has this initiative gone? And part of why it's disappeared is, you know, some of the people who were championing it, because of how the civil service works, might have moved positions, or where they're politicians, they're not actually in government. And this is where I come to the point of institutionalization. And I guess that's where we can underscore a difference. Whereas what Christine has described, although I would argue, you know, not perfect yet, but there is a sense that there is a commitment to institutionalizing it, that this isn't just about programs where you know, you have a beginning and an end date, and 3 years down the line you're done and you move on to something else, but rather really institutionalizing it. And part of the commitment to institutionalization, which people find quite frustrating, I believe Bernard has already talked about, that it takes some time, right? You cannot, you know, Rome was not built in a day. We have come to a space where we've realized internally, but also globally, that, you know, we are certainly not where we should be. And the reason why we want to be there is because things are no longer working how they should. Right? You cannot think of humanitarian support. You cannot think of tackling conflict, fragile context. You cannot think of showing leadership and actually supporting that without thinking about equality, diversity, and inclusion issues, whether it's in terms of including women in gaining peace settlements, or thinking about including non-dominant ethnic groups when you're negotiating for peace. It no longer works for us to achieve the aims of security, foreign and security policy that we want to achieve. And that's why we have to do it. So in that sense, it's the goal, but we also have to be committed to the institutionalization. And right now, I think that we've not yet settled into how that institutionalization can take place. At the same time, I think that if anything, this is very much the moment to think about how we can settle, right? So some colleagues who've worked on this based at Manchester and Leeds have argued that, you know, we're in a moment where potentially the United Kingdom might be losing some of the things that it has an edge in, which is, you know, its diplomatic practices. This is an area where the UK has always been quite good, but we are now situated within a multipolar world, where, yes, you know, the assertiveness of Russia is not just about the assertiveness of Russia. It means that we have a new actor within the international system who might think of the way that the international order currently is as being very different. And you know, we can no longer take the liberal order for granted, and the UK cannot take that liberal order for granted. So if it does actually want to promote the values that are consistent with that liberal order, i.e. human rights, particularly women's rights, minority rights, then we have to do more about the institutionalization and sort of move away from the sort of programmatic paradigm. Now, within the UK, looking at people like yourselves who've worked within the establishment, the expertise is there. So now the point is, you know, how do we go about finding the expertise? I don't necessarily have the answer for that, because that's a luxury I can have for not working in that sense. But there are people who, you know, they do this for a living, who are working within the Foreign Service, who are working within DFID, who are in a space to cross-fertilize between departments to learn how, you know, how to do this work, right? It's not something that we have to import from somewhere. It's there, but we need that commitment to do it precisely because of the international environment. We can no longer take for granted our position in, say, the Security Council and just assume that it will always be there. We have to admit that we are in a relatively precarious state of the evolution of the international system, and we need to be reflective about that.
Thank you, Tony. So I heard there a really clear plea for institutionalization of programs, which are going to essentially take this agenda forward on the world stage. And your point, I think, is that this is in the UK's interest to be a leader in this, because this is the next phase of the kind of liberal order against which is only tyranny. I had a question which I don't know whether you want to answer, or definitely I think I'll flick over to Bernard and Sabine really, which is, it is possible to institutionalize programs in government departments without changing the diversity of representation at board level in those departments. And the question is, I know what I think, but the question is it necessary to change the diversity of representation at board level in order to be able to do the things that you're talking about? Because if you look at the new FCDO, there are only 2 women out of 10 on the board. So you have 8 men and 2 women on the board of a new organisation, which isn't quite yet 50%. But I'd be interested, I don't know, Tony, do you want to comment and then go to Bernard next?
Yes, I'm happy to comment. So, I think the best way to describe it is to use an example. Say, the UK is a liberal democracy. These are the values that it aims to project in the world. Is it possible for the UK to, sit around a table as a potential country mediator and tell another country somewhere else that it needs to include more women around the table, when within its own organizations, we don't see this reflection? Now, I want to highlight that, this is at the basic level, you can call this hypocrisy, and it's not unique to the United Kingdom. And I think that needs to be underscored. But if we are saying somehow we want to do this better, then we have to start from within, because it becomes very difficult to have the moral authority to act in any of these areas externally. I think most people who work within foreign policy and study it will say it's very obvious that you cannot separate what's happening internally, externally. So you need representation. But representation in of itself is not enough. And I would echo what everybody else has said previously, which is that you do need a culture of change. If you have, it is possible to have, equal amounts of women to equal women and men in the same space. But if they believe the same things, where, they see themselves as, the women sort of see themselves as, the outlier, and the system worked well for them and that's enough, and doesn't change anything, then of all good is it, right? And I think that's why, again, going back to Bernard's earlier point, there needs to be clarity about why it is that we want to do this. We have that in different spaces, but if we don't try to bring it together in the way that Christine has described, where we try to mainstream it across everything, where we're not saying, well, sure, policing should really do that, and development should really do that, but let's leave the army aside, or let's leave the FCO aside, then we cannot get to where we want to, because whether we like it or not, all of this different aspects of what security is, both internally and externally, actually work together.
Bernard, your views on that?
Yeah, I think for me, it's fairly short, really. I think, first of all, I think it's straight answer to the question you ask is that, yes, it can be done by unrepresentative leaders. I think it's fairly, theoretically, it can be done. But I think for the reason that Tony explained, it doesn't look very credible. It doesn't look very sincere. And frankly, why is it still like that? It's almost like you're having to argue that, in fact, women should be represented because there is a good argument for it, rather than, can somebody explain why the reverse is happening at the moment? So I think there's lots of reasons why it's possible, but I think the overwhelming argument is that you have to have representation, not because it's fair, but because you will have a more balanced account. I mean, one of my experiences in the police service was that we generally had a gender imbalance. The people who were joining us, women did disproportionately well in the recruitment process, but still remained about 1 in 3 of our recruits. So they were below equality, which meant that in some of the specialist areas, let's say counter-terrorism, firearms, some other departments, the majorities of men were huge. And it was never a good thing for me. I always felt a more balanced gender setup meant that we had a more balanced outlook, that we worked with people better, we understood more, not because either was right or wrong, but because each gender group brought a different perspective. Different minorities bring a different perspective. If you're a different sexual orientation, it brings a more balanced account. So the internal culture is always better for having that balance. And I think certainly it's got to be the case that at leadership level, we have to find dynamic and radical ways to do it quickly. And you can't keep saying, you know, just wait 20 years. People haven't got that long. They've got one life, and they want their kids to grow up in a way that they're able to make progress quickly.
Thank you, Bernard. Right, I'm going to start asking questions from the audience. So forgive me if this becomes a little stilted while I read it. First one is from Ewan Grant, who is a former HMC&E intelligence analyst, who's asking, which minority communities have seen the most progress into the defence and security communities, say since 2010? Why is this so, and which have not, and why? And he says, thank you for all the hugely informative points you have made. So thank you from me too. Who wants to start with that? And that's a question which requires, Bernard, are you saying yes?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you a particular perspective around policing, but I think it's true of the security services as well, is that males from an Asian background have made we've made more progress in terms of recruitment and retention than we have seen, particularly for Muslim women. Black Afro-Caribbean men, we haven't seen the same progress in. So I haven't got all the figures to hand. I'm just giving you in my partly intuitive, but I'm sure there is an evidence base for this. And I think to the reason for that, I think to be absolutely frank, it's about post 9/11 need. It's partly operational need. It's, as we've all said, about being not represented because it's the right thing to do. There's also been an operational need, and that's the biggest thing that's driven it. I can't say the only thing, but that would be my suggestion.
Thank you. Do anyone else want to answer that? Sabine, have you got a perspective? No. Okay, we'll go on to the next question from Bradley Fletcher. Oh, it's disappeared, sorry. Bradley Fletcher asks, increased diversity within defence and security sectors at a time when the UK is struggling to find the right skills and expertise is an opportunity, not a bad thing, it's a good thing. So he'd like the panel's suggestions for how this message can be amplified, what more can be done to essentially reach out and make sure that more people are trying to apply for jobs whenever they can, so that it naturally builds up. Christine, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think, there's various ways that you can approach it, but it's certainly, it can start at the university level and looking at, who's studying what, and ensuring that also at the university level in education that there is that effort to ensure diversity and inclusion. You also have kind of the communication and marketing piece in terms of how are you, communicating these job positions and where are you communicating them? So there's that whole aspect of what message are you putting out in terms of who you want to attract. And that's been the same thing in terms of the police and the military. And when we see kind of these videos of I'm going to call it, warmongering fighters, often it doesn't actually reflect what the police or it reflects part of what they do, but not kind of the whole range of the responsibilities and the roles that they have. And also being, ensuring that you have diversity as part of your messaging to part of role modeling that and ensuring that you are able to access the different communities that you want to employ. And as the panelists have mentioned, and I think Bernard as well, once you have these people as part of your organizations, it's ensuring that you value their contribution, and that you can, you have structures and policies in place to ensure that that they want to stay and contribute fully.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point at the end about contributing fully. So you need to enable them to speak with exactly the same weight as everybody else in the organisation, which was something Bernard actually picked up on before. Sabine, how about you? This is a positive opportunity because we need new expertise and skills. How do we reach out positively?
Well, I think there's two sides to this argument. I think the first is that, there are people within, within the civil service or the national security community who are already from minority communities. I think the question is how do we harness their skills and their expertise? I have been struck over the last, I think, 2 to 3 years, actually, at the level of, anxiety and concern that many young BME, officials have who are working, across the sector, about their lack of, their perception, that they cannot progress up the system. And frankly, I think, when they've heard kind of the sound bites at the top about, improved, coaching for BME staff or whatever, I think they found, that kind of messaging actually quite jarring. I think, the government, when it responded to the ISE report on diversity, recognized that actually what we should do is, similar to what the police have always done, tap up people who have got expertise to try to accelerate the process of getting them, into the jobs, that they can make a contribution to. Again, another comment that some of the, minority communities have said to me, and these are actually professionals working in the field, is the sense that, they don't get the same opportunities to be able to progress their expertise and their experience as their white counterparts. So, you can have officials who get the kind of acting deputy director or the acting director role, and they then, in that period of that year or 2 years, can build up their expertise so that in 2 years' time, they can apply for that SCS job. And I think, most BME officials who I've spoken to feel that they just do not get the opportunities to be able to progress. And so it's a kind of reinforcing catch-22, problem for them. If they're not given the opportunities, they can't develop their skills and then they can't progress up the system. So I think there is something about how do we, address the kind of current cohort who are with the system and actually reassure them, that there are opportunities for them. And I think, we've also got to be much more outward facing. I think, the fact that, the civil service, doesn't really do open recruitment, obviously is going to narrow the intake of people that are coming in. So I think we've got to look at, different ways of trying to bring a new cohort in. And as Bernard has said, if we do not put this as a matter of urgency and approach this differently, we are going to be in exactly the same position in 10 years' time.
Tony, do you have an answer on the question?
Not necessarily, since I'm not necessarily as familiar with the inner workings of the civil service, but I of course see parallels with other types of organizations where you talk the good talk and you have problems with recruiting. But I actually think, just from my outside perspective, that people hear stories about particular places and particular work practices. So the question is, how are those people in a position to facilitate an inclusive workspace, actually working with those people already there? In organizations that I'm more familiar with, things like reverse mentoring has worked, where there isn't an assumption that simply because it's the people who are always in power are the ones who know best, but actually asking people from minoritized backgrounds, you know, how do you go about your processes of working to achieve the overall aims and goals of the organization? And what are the things that obstruct you in able to achieve these and being able to be your full self at your place of work? That could be helpful, because actually what we don't want is situations where, just as Sabine described, where every time we bring up these issues, it's the Black and other minority ethnic groups that are sent to go get some coaching or training on confidence. And it's like, you know, most of these people have confidence in spades. You know, it's similar for women as well. You know, we're always sent to go be better because it's assumed that there is a standard that we must all meet. But we should ask the question, you know, what is that standard? Who defines that standard? And actually, when we're thinking about institutional transformations, that is partly what we're also looking at. And so, you know, one example is that reverse mentoring, but we also cannot put the burden of all the work on the tiny amounts of Black and ethnic minorities that are actually within the organizations.
Thank you. Next questions, I think both complicated and very straightforward. I think this is from Elizabeth Roberts, who says, does addressing basic values such as respect for others, selflessness and integrity provide a global baseline and conduit for achieving diversity and inclusion and implementing the necessary cultural change? She feels there's a concerning lack of values-based leadership, and that this, if we had it, would provide a simple solution to at least part of a complex problem. I don't think any of you are going to say we don't need a values-based leadership. Bernard, what's your take on that?
Well, first of all, of course, yes. But I agree that sometimes it's not always stated clearly, or there's some very long list of values that no one can remember. Certainly one thing I supported was that we said we'd have 4 values, that you could remember. So even today I can remember for 2 different police what they were, police forces what they were, which were integrity, courage, moral and physical, caring and professionalism, which was about standards. So they happened to be things that we could look each other in the eye and knew that that's what we stood for. We didn't always achieve it, but at our best, that's really what we were about. And I think you have to be able to clearly say what you think you stand for is vitally important. I think the second thing for me, which is a bit of a link back to the last question, I suppose, is that, to one of Sabine's points, I think there are 2 fundamental things that really can drive the implementation of your values. I think one is to be transparent and accountable. And the other one is, to Sabine's point, about engagement. So one of the things we found in the police service over the last 30 years, the biggest improvements in behaviour were when technology came along to monitor the performance of policing. So in custody areas where prisons were, where cameras came along, the lawyers came along, social services were going in, nurses were going in. This made a real difference, that you'd actually got observation within the police service, within the building, looking at how the service was delivered. And in fact, made massive improvements in the police service. Volunteering. We had about 5,000 special constables who took all the risks of being a police officer, weren't paid, but came along and patrolled with officers. So I looked at them while they were doing their job, were quite able to go outside and say, I don't agree with what you're doing. I'm not within the organisation, including lay people in the recruitment and the promotion processes. Made another real difference. It's not, if you carry on being the selectors of the new people, you tend to recruit what you were, not the people you aspire to be. But by including other people, it can really, I think, make a big difference. And finally, to include people in assessing whether what you're doing, how you're doing, whatever your role is, whether it be health, civil service, or in my case, policing, including people in the monitoring of that. Not having them sitting on committees who only receive reports, but actually get out, get involved, go and check. I think for about 40 years, well, probably must be more now, the police have had a group called the Lay Visitor Scheme. They're just people who are volunteers who turn up in custody suites without notice and check on the welfare of prisoners. And they do it whenever they want, for no payment, mere expense. I think that's about it. But the risk of somebody walking through the door who might say, I don't think we're doing the right thing here, or that prison needs some help, makes a real difference. So I think that if you're prepared to stand the oxygen of transparency, it will make a real difference and hold you to account about the values you say you stand for.
Thank you, Bernard. That's very wise. And I think there's a lot of stuff coming in here, which I hope somebody is pulling together, because it would be great if we could do all of the things that you're recommending. I'm not going to give the rest of you a chance to answer that, just because we've got so many questions now, and I'd like to keep going, unless any of you really want to. No? Next one is from Mike Maiden, who's asking, to what extent do we suffer from a lack of British identity, to which all, this comes on from the point that Bernard was just making, a lack of British identity to which all minorities, whether based in race, religion or colour, can subscribe, or is the idea of a single identity counterproductive, and what international comparators should we study? So Christine, I'd like to come to you, but I think, Tony, can I start with you?
Yes. So, I mean, I guess I'm skeptical about the idea of a single identity, because the structure of the UK itself is very diverse. I mean, I live up in Scotland, and it's lots of similarities with England, but also lots of differences with England, with Wales, with Northern Ireland, and we're all coming, just as individuals, we're all coming with our own prior knowledge, which we bring into our different institutions. Nevertheless, that does not mean that we cannot ascribe or aim for the same things, right? So whether it's the sort of 4 aims of an organization, or the things that we value as a country, that we can pull together through our various international commitments, but also legal standards in country. I think that Britain, as its own unique case, is very rich, and if anything, that is potentially the British identity, that it is very culturally diverse, and that is something that we should probably leverage, if you can use that word. That, you know, we have people from different backgrounds, and also people newer British citizens, so including migrants as well. I think that if we want to live up to that, the story we tell about ourselves, about being welcoming, then that's the thing that we actually have to leverage. And we cannot think of, like, you know, again, I would worry about who is setting the standard to what British identity is, if we go for the singular as a way to sort of inscribe the hierarchies that we're trying to dismantle.
Is it more about not one identity, but a shared set of values? Christine, how does it look from your perspective?
I think Tony really answered the question. I mean, it's very similar in Canada. There's, you know, we have kind of we've espoused to this idea of multiculturalism, and really the idea that there's such a rich diversity in our country, and that needs to be celebrated. And we've heard kind of our Prime Minister said that is our strength, and the richness of what makes this country. And yes, as you mentioned, I think, you know, the shared values is very key in this point. And if I can circle back to kind of that very quickly, that previous point about those shared values, I think and also what Tony mentioned in terms of, you know, we're not perfect either. And so one of the things I wanted to mention is, in terms of those values, is really consistency and coherence. And coherence in terms of, you know, you have a foreign policy, but ensuring that every aspect of that foreign policy is coherent. And so, for example, we may have a feminist international assistance policy, but yet our assistance, our development assistance is at a long time low. Another example is in terms of Canada's kind of supporting the sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia, which we know is fueling the war in Yemen. And I think that's, you know, Tony will be able to say that that is that same, the same thing is happening in Britain as well. And so there's that kind of inconsistency in terms of the values of that we're espousing to in terms of this feminist foreign policy, but yet we're going and we're doing something else that is against it. And the same thing in terms of that connection, which Bernard talked at the beginning in terms of, and Tony as well, in terms of we have to make sure that we're doing this domestically. We can't, you know, we can't think to be leaders in the world if we are not doing this internally. And you know, we've had our own I'll call it awakenings in Canada. We have our national inquiry on missing and murdered Aboriginal women. And we also, you know, Black Lives Matter, sexual harassment in the police and military, all these aspects are all part of this. You know, if we really espouse to these feminist values, then there needs to be there needs to be coherence in terms of, you know, what we're doing domestically and internationally.
Can I ask you a follow-up question there? So do you think it's fair to say that it is easier to do this to someone else's country, than it is to do in your own? So we can all have foreign policies which say we should, you know, enhance diversity and inclusion somewhere else, and we'll set ourselves up, we'll have it institutionalized, we'll have a program, but actually it's hardest to do it in your own community.
I mean, that's a really good question. I think it's it may be, I mean, it certainly demonstrates what, you know, the kind of leadership that we want to portray, the kind of leadership, the kind of leaders that we want to be in the world. Internally, I think there's a number of, you know, different dimensions, different departments. You have different levels of government, and perhaps there's that added difficulty. But I think at the end of the day, if you have the intention and you put in the efforts, the resources, the time, and, you know, if this is truly a matter of urgency, as it was mentioned before, then the work will get done.
Should get done. Will. Sabine, coming back to the question, which was about national identity, and we've kind of moved on to a question about values. And actually, I just want to build on this. You know, Tony, I think, made the point very clearly that you know, I can't remember, it might have been Christine, that essentially that you're you know, you have to be true to your values, but what happens when your values and your national interest aren't necessarily the same thing? Sorry, Sabine, that's for you, but building on the question about identity.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a really important question, but I think, you know, this is why you've got to have, you know, a process where, you know, you're constantly having, you know, the discussion around, you know, what are our values, and doing it in an open and transparent way. You know, I'll take, for example, the analogy with, you know, the kind of, you know, the global debate on, you know, Black Lives Matter and race and, you know, equality and gender, etc. And what do we stand for? I mean, I think there are some fundamental lessons there. You know, I mean, we are, as you said, at an important moment where we could really progress and advance equality, diversity, and inclusion. But actually, I've been quite concerned in recent months about the direction of the debate, and I can see direct parallels with the kind of, you know, public debate over the last 20 years on Islamist radicalization. You know, what are our values? Where, if we're operating in an environment where these debates have become toxic, or they've become polarized, or you've got some actors that are pursuing an ideological agenda, and you've got authoritative voices whose opinions are being drowned out by, those who shout the loudest. So I think that, the value should also be around our behaviors, and the fact that we have to raise the bar and the etiquette in how we're speaking to one another, on these, complex and sensitive issues. Some of the, kind of public debates I've seen over the last few months, whether it's, with Black communities or white communities, is, where you've got one section dehumanizing another and denying another person their lived experience. And I think, again, the values, the kind of collective values, as I said, goes back to our behaviors, where we should be listening to the views of whether it's communities who have suffered discrimination, inequality, and barriers. And we should also listen to the views of white communities who believe that their aspects of their cultural heritage and identity are being eroded. And I think the values, is again about our behavior in terms of being reconciliatory in how we're addressing these issues, trying to bring people with us. We've got to bring the majority of people with us. These are universal values in terms of how we should approach these issues and focus on what can actually deliver change.
Thank you. I'm just sorry, I'm scrolling through the questions manically because we've got 4 minutes left. I'm just reading, this is Adina Pintili, I don't know, who says, thank you to Rusi for hosting this great conversation. It seems to me that the vast majority of us here today are advocates, allies, and proponents of diversity and inclusion in one form or another. So could the panel speak more on bringing senior leadership who are reluctant on this into the conversation, which I think is really, that's a nice way to sort of end this, because we are trying to have sort of practical things that we can do. Although I'm not sure you're going to find very many senior leadership who are going to say that they're reluctant on it. But Bernard, do you want to start on that? How can we make sure that we're bringing in people who perhaps aren't included in this conversation?
It's a good challenge because it's not straightforward. If the leaders aren't getting involved because of beliefs, then that's really quite difficult. I think it's probably unlikely. It might be a prioritization process. So I think you've got to find a way to influence them. So, I mean, the three things that come to me off the top of my head are, one, obviously the political process. That's why it's there. That even where people aren't in the majority, then they have an opportunity to express themselves through electing people and deselecting people. It may not be the most efficient process in the world, but it can work and it can make a real difference. So I would argue that in a liberal democracy, people should make their best attempts to get involved in that. I think secondly, the media, the best of our media have a great opportunity to amplify small voices and to argue for fairness. And I think that's something else that, getting access through the various forms of mass media we've got to articulate what's wrong. And ideally, I'd always argue that if somebody could say, what would they like instead? A constructive argument defeats a criticism. A proposal will always make weight. And then final thing, obviously, is getting remedies through the law. If persuasion doesn't work, then people should have good remedies. They could go to, certainly in the UK, I think in many other countries too, the courts will apply good remedies on behalf of the citizen against a state that's unfair.
And hopefully it doesn't come to that, because I think certainly in the UK, I think we are taking as a given the fact that the intent is there across government. The question is about practicalities of it. So I think I think you'd have to look far and wide to find a senior leader in the British national security community who did not think that this was important. The question is how. Sabine, I don't know, would you like to add anything on that? We've got 1 minute, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key point is, if just to sum up, I mean, I think strategic leadership is absolutely critical to this debate, and the need for a relentless focus approach on addressing the culture. I think that, you know, we are all at the moment where we should exercise some humility, look deep and hard at our processes, attitudes and behaviours, and ascertain whether it could amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racial stereotyping. You know, this is an uncomfortable process. It's an uncomfortable, debate to have around, you know, looking at our daily working behaviours, but it should be grounded in the realization that we all need to change, and we should fundamentally support each other to change.
Thank you. That's a rousing and encouraging way to end. So I'm going to halt us now. We've reached exactly our cutoff time. I'm going to finish with Bernard's words, which I thought were a way we should all live our life. The risk of standing still is high. Let's take a step forward. So let's all do that. And in the spirit of our Inclusion Week, we should make sure that we're passing that on to somebody else, not just keeping it to ourselves. Thank you all for joining us. I hope at the very least that stimulated some thoughts and hopefully some actions. And this is just to note that this is just the first of these rebalancing expertise in defence and security initiatives. There are going to be more of these from RUSI. They haven't been timetabled yet, but when they are, please engage and join as we carry on to develop this subject. So thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you enormously to our 4 excellent panelists. Thank you.